All right. Last week we were talking about several things. We were discussing political participation in the context of the recent elections, and in particular one group, the Amish. And this particular slide is a bit disturbing. In light of how Christians actually considered their position within the state back in the first 300 years of Christianity. So I shared with you a dialogue, or actually more of a response by a Christian apologist by the name of Origen. And Origen was a 3rd century, very, very educated. He was kind of like a pop star of his day. And he was responding to a man named Celsus, who had lived some 100 years before, who was very critical of Christianity. And we don't have anything left from Celsus's writings except for what Origen quoted in his response to Celsus in this book here called Origen, or it could be, I think some people say Origen, against Celsus. And one of the criticisms that Celsus brought forward was that Christians don't do their patriotic duty, and they abstain from participation in the affairs of state. And I'm not going to go through the whole response. I'm just kind of bringing you back up to speed. But the bottom line was Origen, had said that this is not something that Christians do. And I then contrasted it with what you see in this picture, and I said, oh, how things have changed. And you could write that all in uppercase letters with an exclamation point at the end of it. Things have changed considerably within Christianity. If someone were to take Origen's position today, they would look at you cross-eyed or really funny or cocked head and thinking you're something strange. And yet that has been the historic position of the Christadelphians for over 150 years. To abstain from politics and the political process. So that was where we were last week. I had brought up the argument that's sometimes brought up that, hey, what about Daniel? What about Esther? What about Joseph? They were all involved in the state or the affairs of state. And I said, well, if God intervenes in our lives in such a dramatic way where it's unmistakable, well then we can maybe reconsider. But short of that, we're supposed to follow the precept to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, and you really cannot participate in the political process and be innocent as doves. And I've tried to, for several weeks, point that out. And I think that's what Origen could see and was part of his reasons for refusing or explaining, as he was called, an apologist. Doesn't mean you're apologizing for something wrong, but rather you're explaining or defending your position. And Origen was defending the Christian abstention from the affairs of state. However, today we see something like this, and of all people, the Amish. Now, as disturbing as this is, what happens is that this becomes a bit of a spectacle, and people, catch this and see this, and it's gotten so bad. Oh, by the way, this phenomenon happens about every 4 years, leading up to a presidential election here in the U.S. You will find letters to the editor, you'll find blog postings where there will be a defense in this way. They'll say, well, if Jesus was alive today and he was voting, he wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. And then there'd be a list of reasons why Jesus wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. And then you will also find letters to the editor and blog postings, saying if Jesus was alive and he was voting, he wouldn't vote for Kamala Harris. And you'd have a list of these reasons why Jesus wouldn't vote for Kamala Harris. And, you know, standing from the out on the sidelines, you look at this and you think, what is wrong with Christians? If they can't even get their act together and figure out who Jesus would vote for, then why should I believe anything they tell me with respect to the gospel? You lose your credibility if you're making these declarations, these high pronouncements on who Jesus would vote for, and then you're trying to tell me that Jesus did X, Y, and Z. Okay, good luck. You're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a better time remaining on the sidelines and abstaining from the political process. Anyway, getting back to our friends, the Amish, if you were to type in Amish for Trump, because this is basically what this sign is telling me, this is something I found when I did the search. So now there are t-shirts that you can buy with this particular design with a horse and buggy and Amish for Trump. And you will also find this particular article, which I thought was extremely enlightening, that here in India, of all places, some reporters highlighting the fact that this religious group called the Amish are going to play or can play a very significant role in the outcome of the Pennsylvania vote for the US president. This is quite remarkable to see a group being singled out like this and highlighted. It's phenomenal. Here's another video. It kind of sums up what I'm trying to say. Okay, we've lost audio. Well, I'm going to have to skip it because we don't have time to waste. Something has happened to his laptop, Walter was saying, because the dimensions or the aspect ratios messed up. I don't know if someone can wait in the back. All right, so let's do it from the beginning. And I'll try to read it on the screen here. Did the Amish turn out for Trump? Well, but the experts stayed away from politics for 300 years, and only 5% of them voted because they deeply religious and see themselves as members of God's kingdom, not man's. This year, we discovered that was very different. They indeed voted, they came out to vote, and the Amish community's estimate around between 50 to 60% of them did, and they told us almost unanimously for Trump. Why? Well, we'll start messaging like the sign behind me in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the epicenter of Amish county, your freedoms and rights, it asked, and there was more than one big issue. They firmly oppose women leaders like Kamala Harris because they say the Bible teaches for, local judiciary, non-voters falling off, so I can't. It's way too fast. I don't speak that fast, okay? And let alone trying to read it. The bottom line was typically 5% of the Amish in a normal presidential cycle, 5% of them vote. He's saying now that this last election was 50 to 60% of the Amish voted. This audio issue is going to cause a problem because I have another more important clip coming up, and there's no caption on that. So the Amish in the span of 4 years went from having 5% of the community participating in the election for US president to 60, up to perhaps 60%. And that's a huge, huge swing. And I will say one thing, this could come back and bite the young Amish men if the person they voted for was responsible for starting a new war and the draft was reinstituted and Amish men were called up to service. That's going to bite those men in the rear parts. It's almost like imagining, I shared a in Jeremiah a passage about the Rechabites many weeks ago. If you remember, the Rechabites, they didn't drink wine, they didn't eat grapes. They lived in tents, they stayed away from the city. Imagine if 60% of the Rechabites started drinking wine. Yeah, they would essentially have just dismissed a huge chunk of what their ancestor Jonadab had told them not to do. Now, one thing is certain, that if the Christadelphians were ever to, like the Amish here, vote in mass, to begin voting in large numbers, there's one thing that would be certain. There'd be a lot more diversity than what you saw with that 70,000 Amish sign. And there's much more diversity. What I'm trying to say is much more diversity within the Christadelphian community than in respect to the Amish. I have a feeling behind the scenes there were elders that were leading this and pushing this. I have that sense. The fact is that we're so egalitarian and diverse that we would never be able to pull that off. And that's another issue. Let's say 50% of us voted Democrat and 50% of us voted Republican. We're basically canceling each other out. And what are we gaining? Let's keep looping. One thing for certain, if Christadelphians were to vote, you wouldn't have signs like this. Again, we'd be so diverse. You wouldn't be able to put something like that up in truth. And this is going to lead me up to the next video, which is not going to work. We'll give it a try. No, it's not working. There's something with the laptop settings we've lost. I think a lot of times it's the audio. I don't know if this will make any difference.
More justifications for division.
Yeah, so I mean, there's sound there. It's something's not coming through. This is Jacob. All I can do is give you what's coming out here. So this is from that WCF video. This is really toward the end. And what's interesting, I was talking about diversity within the Christadelphian community. What's interesting about this, it's the only time in the video where all 5 of the people that were sitting in the round table discussion, all 5 people were in agreement on one thing. And what's interesting is what they agree about. I need the speaker microphone.
One of the things that I personally am afraid of if the body to start voting is, would this then cause more just...
You want me to switch back? Well, at least I was getting something with this. Okay, we're back. Nothing. I think we're better off just using a microphone next to the laptop. All right, we'll start over again. You ready?
One of the things that I personally am afraid of if we were, as a body, to start voting is, would this then cause more justifications for division? Because we already see that in just purely humanistic terms, there's a lot more animosity between the Democrats and the Republicans.
That is absolutely true. Voting just brings it more to the forefront.
Right.
It makes it more visible.
I
absolutely understand that. It's one of my fears too. I have known situations where people are already taking very strong political positions on one side or the other, and certain people have felt so unwelcome within the body that they have felt that they could no longer remain.
I am really happy that, like, as in our church community, there's never been a situation where, and it's because we don't vote, but there's never been a situation where, like, a leader is telling us what we should think or vote about, like, political things. Because I agree that I think that would be damaging.
Not to mention illegal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing
That's just campaigning, but
yeah, but you know, there are a lot of churches where they vote as a block. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. So this is the only place in the video where all 5 young people are in agreement on this topic here. And they all agree that it's indeed fortunate that as a community, we have a history of abstaining from politics. And even those sisters, which is remarkable to me, I can't make sense of it, but even those sisters who thought it was okay to vote, surprisingly acknowledged that our traditional position of abstaining from voting had its upside and was a good thing. And that good side, or that upside good thing is, we reduce the possibility of division occurring within our community. And the harsh reality, and Jacob tried to bring this out, is that the more politically active a group becomes, let's say this time Christadelphians, the more politically active, let's say the Christadelphians become, the more likely divisions and hard feelings between brothers and sisters can occur. And political differences can easily affect relationships in a negative way. I remember after the November 5th election, you'd read stories of family members that won't talk to other family members because they knew they voted the other side. That's within your own family. Imagine if my political leanings were being broadcast from the pulpit, and you had Walter, who had just as strong feelings for the opposite party. It's not a good thing. And even these young people can see it. The world's political systems can divide people, even Christians. If countries, states, cities, towns, neighborhoods, families can be divided, even start wars, civil war was a political war, if all these things can be the result of taking sides in the world of politics, why would we expect religious communities to be exempt? So this leads us to a new theme in this discussion about Christadelphians becoming politically active. That is, let's just pretend, let's just say, we decide to become more politically active. We start having classes on encouraging us to do our civic duty. What if we become like the Amish here, the next election in 2028? We turn out, 60% of Christadelphians turn out to vote. What's going to happen 50 years from now if we keep that up? 100 years from now, if Jesus doesn't return? How is that going to affect, how would that affect the body of Christadelphians? Joe?
It's a larger issue than just voting for people. You also have to vote for referendums. You have to vote for municipal, county, and state changes to the law. There's bond issues, there's all kinds of other things. So you're really making yourself more anchored, more chained to the community that you live in, and it actually is like a magnet over time. It doesn't let you go. It makes you committed to have to keep doing it over time.
Okay. It's interesting you brought up the, I guess you can call it metaphor of magnetism or a magnet. I would actually say there's a better, nothing wrong with that, Joe, but I would say there's actually a better metaphor in the Bible as to what would happen to our community. Yeast. Think of how a tiny amount of yeast affects the entire loaf as time passes. At first, the yeast doesn't appear. It's mixed in the dough, but it's still a lump of dough. Nothing's changed. If you didn't have the yeast in it, it still would look like the lump of dough it started as. But as time progresses, and you can see here in this, I won't call it a time lapse, but anyway, these series of photos, you can see with enough time, that lump of dough changes in appearance and in texture. Not only visually does it change, but inside, it's changing. Now, if you recall, those who were here, the previous works, the quotations I had shared from the 2nd and 3rd century Christian apologists, Tertullian and Origen, both of them you can use as an example of what it looked like before yeast was introduced into the lump of dough. Now, if you fast forward 17, 18 centuries later, you can look around at the Christian churches. We are an exception, but for the most part, the leaven has worked its way into the lump of dough. And the Amish are just one tiny example of that. To me, it's the most obvious example because you wouldn't have thought the Amish of all people. But this principle has been working itself into the body of Christ for hundreds and hundreds of years. And how did it start? Well, I'm not going to go into that. If I get back to my anti-Semitism class, I will tell you how it happened, but I didn't have that prepared. But how did it happen? That should be a question in the back of your head. How did we get the yeast in the lump of dough? And this is what I fear would happen to our community. We're not going to look the same. We're not going to taste the same. Our texture is going to be different. I don't think it's a good thing. You know, if we were dough, literally, okay, it would be a good thing. We have a nice loaf of bread, but we're not dough. And yet, the metaphor of leaven, I believe, is a really good one. And that's where I'm going to spend a little time looking at this concept of leaven. If we turn to Mark chapter 8, verse 15, we find this verse. And Jesus, charged them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Okay? I guess it's before magnets, Joe. So Jesus didn't have magnets. Okay, so he had leaven. And he's using leaven here as a warning. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. You could say there's actually two warnings. And in fact, I will say it's two warnings. It's under one larger warning umbrella, but there are actually two warnings here. And we'll look at each one. So the first is to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And the second warning is to beware of the leaven of Herod. And I would argue that these are two different things. But leaven is an apt metaphor in both cases. Now, we all know what leaven is and how it's used in baking, but how is it used here in the context of the Pharisees? How is it used in the context of Herod? And if you read the verses that follow, which I'll read here, what's interesting is a lot of times Jesus will explain what he means when the disciples don't know. Well, here the disciples don't know, and what's interesting, Jesus doesn't explain it to them. So, and they reason among themselves, saying, the disciples that is, "It is because we have no bread." And when Jesus knew it, he saith unto them, Why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not, neither understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes ye see not, and having ears hear ye not, and do ye not remember? When I brake the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? They say unto him, 12. And when the 7 among the 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. And he said unto them, How is it that you do not yet understand? Do not understand. And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man to him, and besought him to touch him. Okay, where in that did Jesus explain what he meant by the leaven of the Pharisees and leaven of Herod? At least in Mark's account, it's not there. Okay? Now, Joe, you probably were going to say, well, somewhere else, which is true, but hold that thought. But here, at least, there's no explanation. We're left hanging. So, what did Jesus mean? Well, as I kind of was leading up to, he did give us some insight, and if you go to a parallel passage in Matthew, I may have the chapter wrong. I've got on my notes here 16, but that says 6. Anyway, somewhere in Matthew, you have this verse, and Jesus said unto them, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay? Leaven and leaven. But what's different here? It's not the leaven of Herod, it's the leaven of the Sadducees. Now hold that thought. Right now I want to focus on the Pharisees. Now if you continue reading here in Matthew, Jesus does actually explain what he meant. Why do you not see that I was speaking to you about bread? No, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then they realize that what he told them to beware of was not leaven, but the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay. So the leaven is teachings, doctrines, attitude, positions. So by comparing Scripture with Scripture, Mark with Matthew, we come to that understanding. With respect to the leaven of the Pharisees, I'm saying, I would propose to you these two different things, the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Jesus was referring to, in the leaven of the Pharisees, the teachings, the traditions of the Pharisees, and he had summarized this one chapter earlier, back in the book of Mark, and I think I've got a quote here. Get a turn. In Mark chapter 7, we'll go back. And here Jesus is quoting from Isaiah, This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. And that's the key there, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandments or commandment, but cling to human tradition. How well you have set aside the commandment of God in order to uphold your tradition. So these would be words directed at the Pharisees. They're the ones that kind of put up the fence around the law and came up with these laws and traditions, and added essentially onto the words of God. Now, we don't have Pharisees among us today. We don't have, we're not following the law in the sense that the Mosaic law with regards to abstaining from certain foods, worshiping on the Sabbath, not pronouncing the name of God, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, even though we don't have literal Pharisees today, we still need to be careful that our worship, our practices, do not get detached from Scripture. We don't want our worship to be based upon human tradition, bogged down with ecclesiastical trappings, man-made rules, customs, but rather we should be worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And of course, that's all based upon the Scriptures. So I would say that we can take Jesus' warning as being something relevant to us. Anyone who's familiar with the Roman Catholic Church would probably better understand what I'm talking about when it comes to the ecclesiastical accretions and additions and traditions that have been passed on. So let's move on to what I think is the much more important warning, and that was, if you recall, in Mark 8:15, Jesus said, also beware of the leaven of Herod. So what is this leaven of Herod? What could it be referring to? Well, if we keep our understanding of the word or metaphor of leaven, and it means teachings and doctrines, how would that apply to Herod? Did Herod have doctrines and teachings? Was he going around teaching the people, this is what Herod says, as far as traditions of Herod? I mean, we don't really have that with Herod. Herod was not a religious figure. The Pharisees were a religious body. Herod was a political figure appointed by the Romans. So we're talking almost like two different categories, the religious world and the political world. And I think this is why we need to pay attention, at least in this discussion about Christadelphian's relationship to the state. I think looking at what Jesus is warning us about here in the leaven of Herod, I think it's very useful to look at it and to understand what Jesus may have been telling and warning his disciples. So let's continue our kind of like sleuthing around, see if we can flush out what the leaven of Herod could mean. So let's start out with, who was Herod? Who was Herod? Now, it's not necessarily as easy a question to seek an answer to. Why? Because there was more than one Herod. There was one Herod, but then that one Herod died, and he had baby Herods. Just like you had Caesar, you had one Caesar, Julius, but then you had Claudius, Tiberius, other Us's, I'm sure, Caligula, we'll throw him in there. So the term Herod ends up becoming a title like Caesar became a title, which is interesting. Jesus didn't say, beware of Herod Antipas, or beware of Herod the Great. He said, beware of Herod. I think that's one important clue to consider. He's not giving the name of one person, but rather a title, a position, perhaps you might say. We all know Herod the Great, especially this time of year, where he was this insecure king who ordered the deaths of all the male children under the age of 2 in the town of Bethlehem after learning the news of the Messiah's birth. Now, Herod the Great died not too long after the birth of Jesus. But this is where I was saying he didn't give birth to baby Herods, but they all then became those who then took leadership position or became political rulers would then be referred to like Herod Antipas or Herod II or Herod, What's interesting about Herod and his family is that they weren't Jews. And yet he was actually called King of the Jews. And what he was actually an Edomite. And the Edomites were a long-time enemy of the Jewish people. And they occupied the southern part of Judea. An interesting fact about history is 100 years before the time of Jesus, the Edomites had a battle, let's just say there was warfare between the Edomites and the Maccabees, who were Jews. The Maccabees prevailed, and the Edomites had a decision. You either all can die, or you all can convert to Judaism. I'm not going to say all of them converted, but the vast majority of them converted to Judaism. So now we have Jews, as far as religious Jews, who aren't Jewish as far as their blood. We have Edomite Jews, and that's what Herod was. And that's how, in some way, you could say he was king of the Jews. And Herod was chosen by one of the Caesars. And then that was kind of like the door, the foot in the door, as far as then having his lineage, his children, being in a position to replace him when Herod the Great died. Now, one interesting thing about Herod is his dad. I don't have his name down here. His dad was he was an Edomite, but he was very, very close to the Romans. And I think he was the one that was first chosen due to his leadership abilities by the Romans to become governor, essentially a puppet, to rule in that part of the Mediterranean world. So that Herod's father gave birth to Herod, and that was kind of like almost a dynasty that was started, and this governing Palestine was then passed from son to son to son, and multiple sons. Throughout each of their rules, regardless of what Herod you want to pick, each had to maintain a friendship, underscore friendship with the Romans. And by Romans, we're talking about those who were governing the Mediterranean, who had the power in that day. And if you weren't a friend of the Romans, there was a term for this, friend of Caesar. You'll actually find it on some of the coinage back in that time. Say, like Herod Antipas, friend of Caesar. And they'd be shaking hands in front of a temple of Jupiter. If you didn't remain a friend of the Romans or a friend of Caesar, well, you would be most likely sent packing. And another friend of Caesar would be chosen, and he would be an opportunity to reign. And I would suggest to you, in the temptation that Jesus encountered in the wilderness for 40 days, when it was said, bow down and worship me, I think it was, and I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. That there's only one person in that time who would be able to give anyone all the kingdoms of the world, at least the world that was known at that time in the Mediterranean. Only one person, and that would have been Caesar. And I don't have a picture, maybe next time I'll have a coin up. It's quite telling to see one of the Herods shaking hands with Caesar in front of the temple of Jupiter, and it's saying, Herod Antipas, friend of Caesar. Another interesting fact about the Herods is that when this whole chain of, we call the Herod dynasty, began, it was a Jewish high priest that actually recommended, in this case, Herod the Great, as the best candidate to succeed his father. And then that high priest, after Herod was put into power, was murdered. Now, Herod was a very, very shrewd politician, and he used what little religious faith he possessed to his own political advantage. He would try to appear religious in order to garner favor among his subjects, who were the Jews. Herod the Great was a very complex man. He was filled with many contradictions. For instance, he built fortresses, he built palaces and temples for the pagan gods of Greece and Rome, while at the same time building the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. You know, if we talk about the temple, the history of the temple, we talk about Solomon's temple. That was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then a second temple was rebuilt under the time of Nehemiah, Ezra. When it got to the time of the first century, when Herod was alive, he put lavish amounts of money into sprucing up the temple, enlarging the temple grounds. And it was to the point where you'd refer to it as the temple of Herod, or Herod's temple, because he put so much into the beautification, the upkeep of the second temple. Walter, were you going to say something? Oh, were you going to ring a bell? Herod scrupulously observed, here's part of the contradiction, he scrupulously observed the Mosaic dietary laws, while at the same time murdering members of his own family to safeguard his political power. And it was actually once said of Herod that it would have been better to be one of Herod's pigs, because of his religious scruples. It would be better to be one of Herod's pigs than to be one of Herod's sons, because he had a habit of killing those in his family who could potentially pose a threat to him. He took the second temple, the temple of Herod that we're talking about here, the temple in Jerusalem. He made it one of the world's greatest wonders, while at the same time defiling it by putting a golden eagle over one of its gates. This was to signify his allegiance with Rome. You know, imagine walking into our building this morning and there's an American flag on the front of our building. That would be the equivalent of putting a gold eagle on one of the gates into the temple grounds. Why? To show his allegiance to Rome. He had to make sure that Rome knew that he was the friend of Caesar. And what's even more mind-boggling or crazy is how Herod meddled with the high priesthood, the Jewish high priesthood. Herod embarked on a policy of strict control over the Jewish priesthood. Normally, the high priesthood passed based upon lineage. You know, it's a hereditary nature of it was a hereditary nature of the office that determined who was going to be the next high priest. Herod threw all that out the door. And what he would do is essentially, it was like, and this wasn't just Herod the Great, it would happen to his successors. He would control who was the high priest. It was based upon who paid him the most money. So essentially the high priest position was now available to be purchased at the highest bidder. And I have some note. Beginning with Herod's reign to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, there were 28 high priests in the span of 107 years. If you do the math, that's on average a new high priest every 3 years. Every 3 years. Now, the high priests weren't dropping dead every 3 years. They were essentially being put into position by the highest bidder. This gives you a little bit of a snapshot of who Herod was. And I don't have the time to connect all the dots as to why we're talking about this in context of Christadelphians and the relationship with the state. But hopefully, if you hang with me, it's going to be 2 weeks, because next week we're going to be closed due to the whole gathering. But when we meet again in January, hopefully I can pick up and connect the dots for you as to what the leaven of Herod was. So thank you very much.